Since my Shirobune retrospective did pretty well, I figured I'd try my hand at an apparently more universally liked visual novel translator publisher, Nekonyan. In a few polls I've ran, Nekonyan actually consistently topped the most liked visual novel publisher ones. While they don't always focus on them, it seems they brand themselves as a company that focuses on releasing the most popular, high-quality moege. But are they really worthy of the praise of best visual novel translation publisher? Let's see if their praise as a relatively consistent and well-liked publisher that people are constantly asking for new releases for is worth it. This is my retrospective video for Nekonyan. Back around the mid to late 2010s, there was a time where I was guessing you can call a relative drought in visual novel releases. There was the newer Soul Press, but between them and Sekai Project, it seemed like any major official visual novel translation needed a Kickstarter in order to succeed and release. There was basically a guaranteed Kickstarter for like almost every visual novel that had a decent name back in the day. It made sense in theory because visual novels weren't exactly a guaranteed financial success, especially for some of the bigger licenses that Sekai Project was getting, and that Soul Press was a super new company. Eventually though, consumers were just getting sick of seeing Kickstarters and just wanted to go back to a time where you just bought a visual novel you wanted when it was actually on the store you wanted, didn't have to pre-order a visual novel translation long before it actually released. While Manga Gamer and JAST released visual novels without Kickstarters, Manga Gamer didn't have too many hype releases outside the occasional Rants title, and JAST at this point was still known as that company that would go super long periods with no releases or updates to projects. Enter Nekonyan, who basically made it a point to never have their translations require Kickstarters. Sure, they would have several Kickstarters in the future, but none of them were a requirement for the visual novel to get a translation, and in fact, the minimum funding to get these visual novel Kickstarters were much lower than before. More on that later. Instead, Nekonyan were fully dedicated to making sure that every single one of the releases did not require a huge bar to climb. Their first visual novel release, Fururaba by SME, was a perfect one to set the stage for Nekonyan's rise. While it isn't their most popular work, it still has a decent amount of fans given that there was no translation of a SME visual novel at the time, especially since the fan translation of Loverable still isn't out as of this video. Fururaba had a solid length, likable heroines, and memorable comedy. Starting with a liked visual novel from a relatively big moe company certainly leaves a good impression. Nekonyan's second visual novel release is what really rose them up to new heights, Sabbath of the Witch by Yuzusoft. Yuzusoft is one of the most popular moege company in both Japan and in the West. This developer defines good presentation with their incredible amount of UI options and just general, very memorable moe characters that stick out and just make people really want to enjoy. At the point of Sanoba's official release, there had been a few fan translations from Yuzusoft in Noble Works, which seems to be a kind of hit or miss in terms of reception, and Draku Riot, which technically didn't even get a full translation because the translation got stopped before they could release a full patch, with only the main heroine Miyu's route missing. It turns out the main reason for that was that Nekonyan was cooking and actually acquired Yuzusoft in the background for a little bit, and have since put a stop to any visual novel translation of a Yuzusoft title. This also includes Amairo Islenauts, which had a partial fan patch and now has no ongoing translation at all as of 2019. What's also particularly notable about them getting Yuzusoft is the fact that at one point, Sekai Project actually had the partnership with Yuzusoft, and they were originally going to release Tenshin Ranman, one of Yuzusoft's most popular earlier titles. Somewhere along the way, that translation got cancelled when the translation got to 100% for some unexplained reason. This also includes the cancellation of Draku Riot, which I believe Sekai Project announced, but never started translating. Nekonyan essentially getting Yuzusoft as one of their main branding partners was huge, because all of their Yuzusoft titles became some of their hugest releases ever. While Sanoba Witch doesn't have quite as many Steam reviews as some of the other titles in the series, nor does it have a Chinese translation like many future ones do, it's still the highest rated Yuzusoft visual novel overall in places like VNDB and Ero Gamescape. Nene and Meguru are two of the most fondly talked about Yuzusoft characters consistently to this day. The success and popularity of Sabbath of the Witch led Nekonyan officially translating or getting the process of translating every single Yuzusoft visual novel that had released in Japan since Sabbath of the Witch released, with the sole exception of Amairo Islenauts. Thankfully, the loss of Amairo wasn't an issue, as they proceeded to go straight to Senran Banka, aka the most successful Yuzusoft visual novel in the West to date, at least on Steam. What helps is that this is the first Yuzusoft visual novel to go full HD, and in addition to Nekonyan's first visual novel to have a Chinese translation, courtesy of Hikari Field. Hikari Field would end up doing Chinese translations of any future Nekonyan titles that had them. I don't know simple or traditional Chinese, so I can't say if these translations are particularly good or not, but it seems like the Chinese fanbase really likes Senran Banka, as they appear to be a huge amount of the reviews on Steam. Either way, the success of Senran Banka was so great, it was the first Yuzusoft title to get an official English Switch release, complete with a limited run games physical option. Riddle Joker and Cafe Stella were also pretty successful, though I would say maybe not quite as overall well received as Sanaba or Senran. I know Riddle's secret spy setting was liked, and for Cafe Stella, well, I do know a lot of people just really like Natsume. Either way, if you like Yuzusoft style, you don't have much reason not to give these two visual novels a chance. What's particularly impressive is how Nekonyan was able to actually be a big part of relatively quick translations of Yuzusoft's new releases. Parquet, Yuzusoft's first all-ages release under Yuzusoft Sour, was an almost simul release with Japan. The English translation was released only a month after it did in Japan. What helps is that Parquet is on the shorter side with a story that I believe is as long as a Yuzusoft common route, but still has its trademark art style. Though based on opinions I've seen online, this seems to be the least liked Yuzusoft title in English overall by far. In 2023, when Yuzusoft announced Tenshi Sozo Reboot in Japan, on that very same day, Nekonyan announced that they already got the license to translate the visual novel, which will be localized as Angelic Chaos Reboot. That's a huge sign to how close Nekonyan and Yuzusoft are, and that English fans essentially associate the two together now. Earlier, I talked about how Nekonyan has only used Kickstarters for a handful of their visual novels, but not specifically to do their translations. Let's talk about a few of those. The first notable one was Aokana 4 Rhythms Across the Blue, developed by Sprite. This was a very important one, as Aokana has had a whole bunch of fan translations attempted, but none ever got completed or even got that far at all. We did get a fan translation of Sprite's first visual novel, Koichako, and it seemed decently popular, but Aokana was one of the more popular Moege received in Japan, according to Aero Gamescape. Nekonyan getting the Kickstarter was very important because it drove confidence that the Aokana curse, as it was called at the time, was going to be broken and that we'd actually get a translation of it. Thanks to the Kickstarter, Aokana's release was able to get a handful of nice extra things. There was a perfect edition for PC in Japan, which included some extra H scenes for Misaki's route. That got added to the English release shortly after the original was funded. Aokana Extra 1 is a fan disc that is an afterstory for Mashiro's route in the original. This was one of the stretch goals of the Kickstarter, and getting that was important for Mashiro fans, but it was also important to show how much the series was respected and hyped in the West. The successful Kickstarter and overall release of Aokana in the West helped revive what was at the time a dead Sprite, aka the developer of Aokana. Keep in mind, at this time, Sprite originally had plans to release a sequel called Aokana Zwei, but it never came to fruition for whatever reason, even now. My personal guess is it relates to the now dead mobile gacha game Eternal Sky, but I'm not 100% sure. But either way, Sprite had another project in mind besides Zwei they wanted to work on, Aokana Extra 2, aka the fantasy for Misaki Tobisawa. Thanks to the Western's successful release for Aokana, that actually got Sprite to not only revive as a company, but to complete Extra 2 and to even have Aokana get more romance spin-offs, starting with Aokana If 01, starring Minamo. They also started a brand new company, Filmic Novel, to focus on shorter film-like visual novels. Two of the announced newer series so far are Sumire no Iroto and Jashin-chan 7th Devil. I think it's safe to say Nekonyan will publish and English translate these after they come out in Japan. The next notable Kickstarter release is King Koi Golden Loverish, developed by Saga Planets. This is a very popular visual novel, both in Japan and in the West. Nekonyan was able to get a successful Kickstarter as well, following a similar model to Aokana's of having a low budget just to fulfill physical merch requests. They have been able to get the original and the fan disc Golden Time out in a timely manner. The success for them seems to be enough that Nekonyan was able to get licenses for more Saga Planets titles, Floral Flow Love and Kakenuke Seishun Sparking. However, the King Koi series release had some issues, more on that later. Nekonyan is one of the few companies who were able to save titles that were originally going to be released by Soul Press. The first is Future Radio and the Artificial Pigeons, developed by Laplacian. Laplacian developer originally had their visual novels published by Soul Press, but the CEO unfortunately had the issue of running into being FTB fortified, aka tax fraud, as well as apparently not paying people in the industry that he should have been. When Soul Press essentially closed down, all the other Laplacian developed visual novels got spread around to different translation publishers. Jast got Ricky Horny, and Laplacian themselves ended up self-publishing Cyanotype Daydream, and Nekonyan was the one who ended up translating Future Radio and the Artificial Pigeons. Thankfully, this release didn't have any issues. To some fans, it was a better release than Cyanotype Daydream, which had the controversy of removing the sexual content, among other things. Nekonyan's release of Future Radio had full uncensored H-scenes similar to earlier releases, like Newton and the Apple Tree. The next Soul Press rescue was Iroseka or Irotoridori no Sekai, developed by Favorite. Iroseka is by the same company who made Hoshizora no Memoria, so if you read that, some people consider Iroseka an even better version of Hoshimemo. Soul Press originally had a Kickstarter for the translation of Iroseka, which just barely got funded. However, with Soul Press's closure, the unfortunate souls who supported that Kickstarter, me included, likely have to pay yet again to read this visual novel. Thankfully, Nekonyan will release this without a Kickstarter, and it helps that apparently at one point, some of the original team members of Nekonyan had been hoping to get a title like Iroseka because it was one of their favorite visual novels in Japanese. The final and most recent save was Onikiss, which was actually released before Soul Press closed, unlike the other two. Thankfully, since Onikiss had already released before, all Nekonyan had to do was touch up the translation a little and set up a system where the original developers actually got money. Now I'm just going to briefly go over some of the many other visual novel releases that Nekonyan has done over its tenure. I mentioned earlier that Futuraba was Nekonyan's first ever visual novel release, and they have translated a few other visual novels by SME, including Making Lovers and its fan discs, as well as Sugar Style. These are notable as they're some of the few popular post-high school pure romance stories that exist in the visual novel medium. They've also been able to get a decent amount of visual novels by another comedy-heavy developer, Asa Project. This includes Sankaku Renai, Koikari, Love for Hire, and Renai X Royale. All three of these visual novels have been some of the funniest visual novels I've read in the over 10 years I've been reading visual novels. They've also been able to get Hello Lady by Akatsuki Works, which was kind of notable because the only other title that had an English translation was a fan translation of Komyu. Nekonyan's release of Hello Lady was the Superior and Telekia version, aka it came with the fan disc content as well as a brand new True Route. The final visual novel I want to talk about before moving on is Clover Days Plus by Alcott. This is a fairly notable release for a few reasons. One, it originally had a fan translation announced 9 years ago, but got cancelled along the way. Clover Days had gone through a temporary ban on Steam, but got saved thanks to Hikari Field, the official Chinese translator. Clover Days is also by far the most popular Alcott title, and apparently has a good mix of character development and melodrama in addition to the moe. For reference, other Alcott visual novels include things like My Girlfriend is the President, Onigako and their fan discs, and those were translated by Jast. There are many other releases Nekonyan has announced but not released yet, so be sure to go to their website to see what else they have so far. Now I want to briefly go over some of their more notable translators and their social media presence. The CEO of the company, Akero, usually credited as Christian Ermontrot, actually has translated some of Nekonyan's titles, including Futuraba, a few routes of Aokana, and a few Yuzusoft titles. T-Back has done a few Yuzusoft and Aokana routes as well. Blick Winkle seems to be focusing on the comedy-heavy titles like Making Lovers and the Asa Project titles. Chewy, DK, and DXS seem to be their go-to editors. Their Twitter, Discord, and general social media presence seems to be a joint mix of Kiria Aoi and Nebnev. So while I've generally given praise to Nekonyan, they were most definitely not without some degree of controversy and unfortunate issues. While the visual novel itself was pretty well received and even got its fan disc translated in a relatively timely manner, unfortunately the Kinkoi original release had a whole bunch of bugs that took at least a few months to get patched up, but even then, there's apparently still a few issues in the current release. IX Sheetel by Hooksoft had an issue related to H-scenes not having voice acting that was found out by yours truly when I was doing some research on release. It took a few days to patch it in. Most visual novel publishers have done minor post-release patches to fix a bunch of typos. However, Nekonyan goes a bit further in that they have a dedicated bug reports channel in their Discord. They also recently added a feature in some of their non-Steam versions of visual novels. Their EXEs are loaded with a way to connect to the internet to get the latest version of a visual novel patch, so users don't have to follow social media or go to a store page to get that latest patch. Some may see these features as a good thing, but I personally consider them a net negative. Maybe I'm just a product of being a gamer from the late 90s and early 2000s, but I consider these features basically having a company admit that anything they release has a decently high chance of having some bugs or typos on release. I'm gonna sound like a boomer, but I miss the days where developers, especially AAA ones, had to make sure the releases were as bug-free as possible. When someone released a game that was too buggy, it actually hurt their reputation, and the companies had actual pressure to release things not that buggy on launch. I'm disappointed that even the visual novel medium, a text-heavy one at that, has enough issues that has to warrant at least minor patches in most releases these days. Now, I know it's weird to harp on this on Nekonyan in particular, when Shirobune has had almost equally buggy releases, and Sekai Project has had much worse single releases. But as said, Nekonyan having the auto updater and that bug report feature is essentially admitting defeat on launch. Not a good look in my eyes. While Manga Gamer and Jast do have occasional minor patches, it feels like they do it much less often than the others, so I wish more companies just functioned like them. Going into a new topic, Nekonyan sadly has the curse many visual novel translation companies have, where they announce a few projects and for one reason or another, they constantly get delayed well past when it was announced. For example, Nekonyan has had Melty Moment by Hooksoft really close to when they first opened as a company, and they still haven't released it to this day. As said earlier, Futadaba was their first visual novel release ever. On its success, they promised a definitive edition where they would get Vita exclusive scenes and add them to the PC version, as well as a Switch port. This was announced not too long after the original release back in 2017, and has had no news since May 2023, outside apparently there being programming issues. Nekonyan used to, at one point, have their own store similar to Manga Gamer, Jast, Denpasoft, or Jorin. However, there was a point around 2020 where their payment processor stopped them from being able to sell eroge. They could still sell soundtracks and have patches. However, as of 2023, their site is now a husk of being this low-effort site just to host patches. However, people have had issues being timed out or being unable to access the 18+ patch site. Instead of just making a new site that works, Nekonyan just made a Google Doc just to have people report their issues to fix this already low-effort site. It's possible that the issue is fixed if you're watching this video later on, but the fact that it's this frustrating and they don't just fix their site already is a pain in the ass when already locating 18+ patches is frustrating enough as is due to Steam disallowing public 18+ patches from being posted for visual novels. Thankfully, the upside is Nekonyan is basically the opposite of Shirobune in that they'll put their licensed visual novels on basically every non-DRM visual novel store they can think of. They'll still be put on Steam of course, but also Manga Gamer, Jast, Denpasoft, etc. So if you're the minority that doesn't use Steam, then things are likely a lot easier for you. However, Steam, by many poll results, is by far the most preferred online visual novel platform store. Nekonyan's translation style tends to keep honorifics, especially for their Moege titles. What's a little more hit or miss is their usage of modern online memes in their more comedy-heavy visual novels. Most people overlook them, but one I guess couldn't get overlooked enough was in their release of Renai X Royale, where there is a meme translation choice of calling Yoshinori an incel. It's to the point that this is the first and currently only time Nekonyan got one of those fabled anti-localization fan patches specifically to fix that incel choice. This is kind of a nitpick, but I wish Nekonyan didn't get so off topic in their social media sometimes. Visual novel companies tend to have a dry, yet informative Twitter presence, usually just switching between announcements, status updates, releases, and sales. However, companies like Nekonyan try to add a little more spice in their Twitter presence, which I'm not entirely against. In recent times, they tried making random little tweets that sadly don't really have much to do with visual novels they sell. For example, they randomly made a tweet to watch this one random airing anime. They made a bunch of polls that arguably relate to visual novels, like things like favorite body parts and panties. But when they make a poll about favorite cell phone, I think this is way past what I would think would be the point of a visual novel publisher's social media. Finally, I personally don't think commenting on internet drama that has nothing to do with the selling of their product, it just doesn't look good to me. Isn't the idea of a publisher to be, I don't know, help sell the products you're partnered with? Like I said, I don't mind official social medias being a little spicy. Just, while making meme tweets, at least talk about popular visual novels they've released. To me, if Nekonyan wants to make polls, they got plenty they could make with their catalog of popular Moege. To finish off, Nekonyan had a few release controversies that technically weren't their fault, but still worth talking about regardless. Hello Lady was originally going to release without mosaics in their H scenes. However, close to the actual English release, apparently the Japanese publisher they were in contact with changed or something, and that prevented Hello Lady's English release from being demosaiced. Their first non-visual novel game, Lerona and the Land of Ruins, was announced as an action shooter game with bad-end H scenes. Close to the actual English release, the developer prevented them from releasing the 18+ version, which caused many people to lose interest. So after talking about everything in this video, where does Nekonyan stand? I do think at a minimum, based on their many popular releases and currently one of the few companies to actually have basically all their releases on Steam, that alone makes them at least top 3 visual novel translation publisher. The fact that they make it a point for all their releases to be on every non-DRM store makes their marketability easily the largest. However, I wouldn't quite put them at my personal number 1, or at least easily. While not the only publisher who does this, their increasing amount of buggy releases is quite annoying, especially since they seem to accept that their releases will have bugs with their bug reports channel. The fact that they go off the typical style of announce a visual novel, then wait years to release is something I've gotten tired of as a whole, especially with releases that get announced years ago with no news. While minor, I think their social media could use some work, but at least they try, unlike some others. As a Moege fan though, them basically translating all the popular modern ones makes me fairly biased towards Nekonyan as a company, despite their flaws. Hell, if they didn't translate Making Lovers back in 2020, I would not have found what's now easily my #1 favorite visual novel heroine. So I guess that would put Nekonyan at #2 favorite, right behind Shirobune. Thanks for watching everyone. If you have any questions, comments about Nekonyan or this video, feel free to leave a comment below.